Daniel Marsh bid $47 on his father's storage unit at a public auction, and his uncle laughed loud enough that the auctioneer paused. 3 days later, the laughing had stopped, and Daniel understood why his father had never talked about the unit at all. Daniel was 28 years old the morning his father died, and he had been in the room for it. He had driven 4 hours from Springfield in a car with a failing heater, arriving at the house in Calloway, Missouri at 4:12 in the morning, and his father had been awake enough to recognize him, which was what mattered. Walter Marsh was 61 years old. He had been a precision machinist for 34 years, first at the Atlas Metalworks plant in Jefferson City, and then, after the plant closed in 2004, on his own, in ways that Daniel had never fully understood and had not thought to ask about. He was a man who built things, not as a hobby, not on weekends for the sense of satisfaction it gave him. He built things because he understood material and processed the way other people understand language, fluently, instinctively, with an accuracy that was invisible unless you looked at what he'd made. The porch on the house in Calloway, Walter had built that in 2003. The back addition, the workshop, every cabinet in the kitchen, Walter had built those too, over a span of 12 years, working evenings and weekends with a patience that Daniel had watched and admired and never inherited. What Daniel had inherited was the eye. He could look at something built or made and know whether it was right. He could not always say why. He could not replicate it, not yet. But he knew. That distinction between seeing correctly and doing correctly was something Walter had observed and talked about once, in the way Walter talked about most things, briefly, without editorializing. When Daniel was 16 and had expressed frustration at a project that had not gone the way he'd intended. "You know it's wrong before you've measured it," Walter had said. "That's worth more than you think. Most people can't see it even after you point at it." Daniel had not understood what that meant until much later. Walter's assets, on the morning he died, were recorded in documents prepared by his regular attorney in Calloway, a man named Virgil Pruitt, who had handled Walter's affairs for 2 decades. The house on Sycamore Street, 1,400 square feet, built in 1962, with a $74,000 mortgage balance and 3 years of property tax that had been deferred during the illness. The 2009 F-150 pickup, 231,000 miles, titled in Daniel's name after a transaction 4 years earlier that Virgil had documented but which had not come up in the estate proceedings. A checking account at First Bank of Calloway, $3,844. A savings account at the same bank, $612. A life insurance policy for $50,000 purchased in 1998 with a beneficiary designation that had been amended 11 months before Walter's death, and storage unit 14 at the Millhaven Self-Storage facility on Route 7, rented month to month for $68 per month, paid current through the end of April. The unit was not mentioned in the estate documents. It had not been listed in the asset inventory. Daniel would not know about it for 6 weeks. Craig Marsh drove up from Kansas City the day after Walter died in a car that had cost more than the house on Sycamore Street. He was 47 years old, Walter's younger brother by 6 years. And he worked in commercial real estate in a way that had made him comfortable and had given him a very specific set of skills. Skills related to paperwork, to asset evaluation, to the identification of what a property was worth, and the mechanisms by which that value could be transferred. He had been helpful in the days following the death in the manner of someone who understood that helpfulness is a form of positioning. Phone calls made. A funeral home contacted before Daniel had thought to look up the number. Documents collected and organized on the kitchen table in a manila folder that had appeared there, without anyone having placed it there deliberately, as far as Daniel could tell. Craig had visited Walter twice in the previous 10 years. Once for a Thanksgiving 8 years ago that had gone fine, and once, 6 months before the death, a 4-day visit that Walter had described to Daniel in a phone call afterward, using only the words. Craig came up to sort some things out. Daniel had not pushed. He had thought, at the time, that Walter was tired and that the visit had been routine. He had not thought about it again until he was sitting in Virgil Pruitt's office with a manila folder on the desk between them, and Virgil was reading the beneficiary amendment aloud. The amendment to the insurance policy, dated March of the previous year, changed the primary beneficiary from Daniel directly to the estate, a modification that seemed technical and almost meaningless until Virgil explained what it meant in practice. It meant the insurance proceeds would pass through probate into the estate's liquid assets before any distribution. It meant Craig, as the co-executor named in a will that had been amended 4 months before Walter's death by an attorney in Kansas City whose name Daniel had not seen before, would have joint authority over the dispersal of those funds. The will was valid. The amendment was valid. Walter had driven himself to the Kansas City attorney's office, had read the documents before signing, had declined twice when asked if he wanted more time to consider. Was he coerced? Daniel asked. Virgil folded his hands on the desk. He was a careful man. He took a moment with a question. He was alone in the office both times he came in. He demonstrated understanding of the documents. There's no legal basis for challenging it. That isn't what I asked. Virgil looked at him. No, I don't believe he was coerced. Daniel looked at the window. Outside, Calloway's main street ran 4 blocks in each direction and ended at grain elevators on both ends. A dog was crossing slowly in the middle of the road, and no one was honking at it. He did this deliberately, Daniel said. He signed the documents deliberately. Yes, he let Craig do it. Virgil said nothing for a moment. Then, he came in here about 1.5 years ago, before the Kansas City business. He sat where you're sitting, and he asked me whether a man could legally prevent his estate from being contested if he was expecting it to be contested. I told him there were things he could do. He asked me to be specific. I was specific. He stopped. He thanked me and left, and I didn't hear from him again. When Craig produced the will and the amendment, I understood what had happened. Walter had let Craig believe he had won, and he had made sure that what Craig had won was exactly what Craig was going to get, no more. The house, Daniel said. The house, yes, and what it netted after the mortgage and the delinquent taxes and the estate costs. What did it net? The hearing is next week. My estimate is somewhere between $6,000 and $9,000. Shared, the probate proceeding took 6 weeks. The house sold at estate sale for $82,000, which after the $74,000 mortgage balance, the delinquent taxes, $8,400, which Craig had failed to discover or had chosen not to mention, and the estate administration costs, produced a net of $3,200. Daniel's half was $1,600. The F-150 was not part of the estate, having been titled in Daniel's name, and Daniel sold it for $3,800 to a man in Lebanon who needed a working truck and was not particular about the mileage. The life insurance paid $50,000. Craig's executor fee was 12%, which was the upper boundary of what Missouri statute permitted, and which Virgil challenged on Daniel's behalf and lost, because Craig had produced documentation of his time spent on the estate administration that was thorough enough to justify it. After the fee and the estate's remaining debts, Daniel received $17,400 from the policy. Craig received the same as the residuary beneficiary under the terms of the amended will. Daniel drove back to Springfield with $22,800 total. The life insurance share, the house share, the truck money, and the feeling that he had watched something be taken from him with a great deal of paperwork and almost no malice. Craig was not a cruel man in the way that word usually means. He was efficient. He had seen an opportunity and had planned carefully, and had executed his plan with the competence of someone who did this kind of thing professionally and was not troubled by it. He did not call Daniel after the probate closed. He sent a text message that read, "Take care of yourself, Dan. Call if you need anything." Daniel did not reply. 6 weeks after the probate hearing, Daniel drove back to Calloway. He was not entirely sure why. Some impulse that he did not examine, to see the town again, to drive past the house on Sycamore, to sit for a while with the fact that his father was gone and that the place he had grown up in now belonged to an estate and would be someone else's house by the end of the year. He drove the rental car through town slowly, past the grain elevators and the BP station and the First Bank of Calloway, and he turned down Sycamore and idled past the house and looked at the porch Walter had built in 2003 and drove on. He was leaving town when he passed the Millhaven Self-Storage facility on Route 7. The auction notice was on the board at the entrance, the kind printed on yellow paper and tacked to a corkboard inside a locked plexi case. He pulled over and got out of the car and read it. 7 units. Saturday, April 16th. 9 in the morning. Unit 14 was in the third column, 6 lines down. He called Craig that evening from his motel room on the edge of Calloway, which was the kind of motel where the cable television had 12 channels and the parking lot light shone through the curtains all night. "The storage unit on Route 7, Daniel said. "Dad had it." "Did you know about it?" A pause. "What storage unit?" "Unit 14 at Millhaven. It's going to public auction next Saturday. The estate didn't list it." A shorter pause. I must have missed it in the asset search." "Do you know what's in it?" "No." Well, Craig's voice shifted into the register he used for things that were being managed rather than discussed. "Whatever's in a storage unit a man was paying $60-some a month for probably isn't material to the estate at this point. We've settled. If you want to bid on it for sentimental reasons, that's your call. I'm going to bid on it. Suit yourself. A beat. I'll have someone take a look, just to be thorough." Daniel said, "I'll see you there," and hung up. He lay on the motel bed for a long time after that. The parking lot light came through the curtains and a thin white bar across the ceiling. He thought about his father driving himself to a Kansas City attorney's office and sitting across from a stranger and signing papers that gave Craig what Craig had always been going to take, and then driving home and going on about his life and saying nothing about any of it. He thought about what his father had been doing with a storage unit for 20 years, paying $68 a month, saying nothing. He fell asleep with that thought still in his head. The morning of the auction was 42 degrees and overcast, the kind of April day in central Missouri that cannot decide whether winter is done with it. The Millhaven lot had 12 cars when Daniel arrived at 8:45. He had signed in at the facility office and received his bidder number, 11, from Dorothea Haynes, who ran the facility and had for 19 years, and who looked at him when she handed him the number with an expression that was not quite readable, and said only, "Unit 14 is the 6th lot." Craig arrived at 8:55 in the Mercedes. He had a man with him, early 40s, jacket too new for the occasion, carrying a clipboard with the body language of someone who did this professionally. He did not look at Daniel when they crossed the lot. 6 of the 7 units sold before Unit 14 came up. A box of exercise equipment, a couch and television, someone's grandmother's china in unmarked boxes, a collapsed canoe, a unit full of construction scraps, a unit of uncertain furniture under tarps. The whole thing moved quickly. The regular auction crowd knew what they were looking at and bid accordingly. Unit 14. The auctioneer unlatched the door and rolled it up. The interior was mostly shapes under tarps. The cedar and oiled metal smell came out into the cold air. The crowd looked. Nobody moved forward. $25 to open, the auctioneer said. A man in a feed store cap bid $25. A woman with an estate sale tag on her jacket bid $30. The feed store man bid $35. The woman went to $40. Daniel bid $47. Craig's man raised his card. The auctioneer looked at Daniel. Daniel did not move. Craig's man bid $52. Daniel bid $53. Craig's man turned his head toward Craig. Craig looked at the unit for a moment. Then he made a small gesture with his right hand, a flick of the wrist that meant something to the man with the clipboard. The man lowered his card. $53, the auctioneer said. Going once, going twice. He looked around the crowd. Nobody moved. Sold. Bidder number 11. Craig turned and looked at Daniel for the first time that morning. His expression was composed. He said, loudly enough to carry, "You paid $53 for your grief, Danny. I hope it's worth it to you." Then he walked back to the Mercedes. The man with the clipboard followed. Daniel did not say anything. He waited until the Mercedes had pulled out of the lot, and then he went to the auction table and paid $53 in cash and got his receipt and walked to Unit 14 and stood in the opening. He had not been inside before. He had not known it was there until 6 weeks ago. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. The unit was 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The corrugated roll-up door had a salt stain along the bottom seam from years of weather, and the interior ceiling showed 2 water stains that turned out, on later inspection, to be old. The unit had not leaked in a long time. The floor was poured concrete, clean. The smell was cedar and machine oil, and beneath that, faint and dry, the particular smell of metal that has been worked and cleaned and put away properly. Along the right wall, shelves, not wire shelving from a home improvement store. Solid wood shelving, 3/4-inch plywood with pine framing, bolted into the wall studs with 3-inch lag screws. 12 shelves, floor to ceiling, each one level within a 1/4 inch. Daniel knew, from having watched his father work, what that kind of accuracy in a wall installation required. It required a level, a drill, the right bit, and the patience to do each bolt twice, once to seat it, and once to tighten correctly. Each shelf was labeled at the right end with a year on a strip of masking tape in Walter's block printing. The oldest year visible was 1989. The most recent was 2 years before Walter's death. 31 years of labeled boxes, uniform in size, arranged chronologically from floor to ceiling. The floor space was taken by shapes under canvas tarps. Walter's tarps, the kind with metal grommets, heavy duty, the olive drab ones he had used in the workshop on Sycamore Street. Daniel lifted the nearest corner of the largest tarp. A Bridgeport knee mill, Series 1. Cast iron table, chrome-plated ways. A digital readout had been retrofitted at some point, a 2-axis Newall system mounted to the left of the quill. The table was clean. The ways were oiled. The spindle guard was down. Someone had cleaned this machine properly before covering it, not just wiped it, cleaned it, the way you clean something you intend to come back to. Daniel stood with his hand on the tarp and looked at it for a moment. A Bridgeport in this condition, a restoration, effectively, was worth between $8,000 and $14,000 depending on who was buying and whether they knew what they were looking at. He pulled the second tarp. A South Bend 9-inch lathe, probably 1978 or 79, fully restored. The compound and cross slide were clean. The chuck jaws showed no rust. The lead screw was oiled. He pulled the third tarp, a Brown & Sharp surface grinder. a machine he recognized from a photograph in one of the machining books he'd found in Walter's shop at the house. The fourth tarp, a Doal vertical bandsaw, a 16-inch model, with a new blade still in its packaging sitting on the table. The fifth and sixth tarps, a drill press, an air compressor, and, stacked against the left wall, 4 welding machines, a TIG, a MIG, and 2 older stick welders that had been cleaned and boxed, but not covered. Along the back wall, a pegboard, 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, hung with tools. Wrenches in ascending order from left to right, combination wrenches, box end sets, adjustable wrenches at the far right. Micrometers in their cases, 6 of them, each on its own hook. Tap and die sets in labeled rolls. Calipers, gauge blocks. Dial indicators in felt-lined cases, and below each item, painted on the pegboard in Walter's careful hand, a silhouette outline, so that Walter would know, at a glance, if anything was missing or out of place. Daniel stood in the center of the unit and turned slowly. He was looking at a machine shop, not a storage unit. A machine shop, disassembled and packed with the care of someone who intended to put it back together. He went to the shelves and found the box from 4 years back, pulled it from its place, and opened it on top of the tool chest near the door. Inside, project notebooks. Graph paper, spiral bound, filled with Walter's block printing and dimensioned drawings. Part sketches with tolerances noted in thousandths of an inch. Client names and addresses in the left margin. A rate sheet folded into the back cover. $95 per hour for general machining, $110 for precision work to tolerance under 1,000th, $125 for tooling and die work. He opened the most recent notebook. The first entry was dated 3 years before Walter's death. The last was dated 14 months before he died. 16 clients over the active life of the book, spread across 4 counties. The final ledger entry read, total accounts receivable, $4,360 outstanding, to be collected when circumstances allow. HD, deferred per agreement. He set that notebook down and went back to the shelves and pulled the oldest box, the one labeled 1989. Inside, the first project notebook. Walter's handwriting younger, slightly less controlled, the letters tall. The first entry was a drawing of a bushing, simple, with 3 dimensions noted. Below the drawing, first job WTM Marsh Precision, Jan 6, 1989, client, Debrecht Ag Repair, Versailles part, replacement bushing for pitot shaft. Time, 4.5 hours. Material, cold rolled, $12. Invoice, $62. He had been doing this since 1989. 31 years, through the plant years and the post-plant years and the illness. All of it. $68 a month. A unit no one had thought to look for. And a note. He found it tucked inside the cover of the most recent notebook, written on the back of a Millhaven rent receipt, and folded once. Dan, if you found this, you drove here yourself. That's what I thought you'd do. The machines are yours. The clients are yours if you want them. Dorothea Haynes at the front office knows the rest. I'm sorry I wasn't better at saying things. I was better at building them. Dad, he read it 3 times. He folded it the way Walter had folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he sat on the tool chest and looked at the unit around him for a long time. Outside, through the open door, the April light was coming through the cloud cover and landing flat and white on the Millhaven gravel. He had driven 4 hours through the night to be in the room when his father died. He had sat in Virgil Pruitt's office and listened to what Craig had done and had not said much, because there had been nothing useful to say. He had driven back to Springfield with $22,000 and the particular exhaustion of understanding that something had been taken from you with great care and thoroughness. He had come back because he could not quite finish leaving. He sat in the unit for a long time. Then, he got up and went to find Dorothea. Dorothea Haynes was 63 years old and had been running Millhaven for 19 years. And she had the quality that long-tenured people in small businesses develop: a thorough knowledge of what happened on her property and an absolute discipline about who she told. She brought Daniel coffee when he knocked on the office door, and she sat across from him at the metal desk and told him what Walter had told her the previous spring. He drove himself out here on a Tuesday afternoon, she said. He could still drive himself then. Barely. He sat where you're sitting, and he told me his situation. He said his brother had been working toward the estate for a long time, and that he had decided some years ago to let him have what he was going to take: the house, the insurance, most of it, and to set aside the things that mattered in a place Craig wouldn't know to look for. He asked me to let the unit go delinquent after he died and run it through standard auction. No family notification, just the county notice on the board. And if Craig sent someone to look at it before the auction, I'd show them what anyone would see from the door: boxes and tarps. Which is true. He sent a young man 2 days before the auction. She smiled faintly. He stood in the door for 90 seconds and took 2 photographs and left. Daniel thought about Craig's man with his new jacket and his clipboard, standing in the opening of Unit 14 for 90 seconds and seeing tarps. What did Dad say about me? Dorothea folded her hands on the desk. He said he didn't know if you'd come. He said if you didn't come, it meant he'd misjudged you, and then whatever was in the unit could go to whoever won it, and that would be acceptable. He said if you did come, it meant he'd been right. And then I should tell you the rest. The credit union account. She opened the desk drawer and took out an envelope. Inside, a piece of paper with an account number, a routing number, and the name of a branch in Jefferson City. Below those, a handwritten note in Walter's printing. Account opened 2013. Joint, your name added same week as first Millhaven lease. Balance as of last statement, $43,800 savings, $6,200 CD maturing August. Credit Union of Central Missouri, Jefferson City branch. Bring the death certificate and 2 IDs. Daniel held the paper for a moment. $50,000. Set aside over 11 years in an account that had never appeared in any estate document because Craig's asset search had run through the same commercial financial discovery channels Craig used for real estate work. And Walter had specifically chosen a credit union outside those channels, in a city 40 minutes from Calloway, and had added Daniel's name to it as a joint owner before Craig had started paying close attention. He planned this, Daniel said. He planned the part he could plan, Dorothea said. He told me he couldn't stop Craig from taking the house. He said the house was always going to go. Craig had been talking about what to do with the house since their mother's funeral, 7 years before. He said he'd decided a long time ago that Craig could have the house and the insurance and whatever else he could find, and that by the time he found it, there would be nothing left to find that mattered. She poured more coffee into Daniel's cup without asking if he wanted it. He said the machines were what he wanted you to have, she said. He said a man who inherits a house has a house. A man who inherits a working business has something to do for the next 30 years. She poured more coffee into Daniel's cup without asking if he wanted it. He looked at the account number on the piece of paper. Then he looked at the window behind Dorothea's desk, through which the Millhaven lot was visible. The gravel, the row of unit doors, Unit 14 at the far end with the roll-up door still up from the morning. From this distance, the open door was a rectangle of shadow. He had bid $53. He had come back to Calloway because he could not quite finish leaving. He had stood in a cold parking lot and listened to Craig say something dismissive and had not answered. because there had been nothing useful to say. He had gone into the unit not knowing what was there, and he had stood in front of a Bridgeport knee mill in excellent condition, and he had understood, standing there, that his father had not simply been storing things. He had been keeping them for something, for someone. Daniel looked at the account number again. $50,140, a machine shop worth $40,000 in equipment. Conservatively, 31 years of client relationships across 4 counties. His own name on an account that had been opened before Craig had started paying close attention. His father had planned this. Not from anger, not from spite. Walter Marsh had not been a spiteful man. He had planned it the way he planned a machine job. From the tolerance in, working out what was required to hit the number, doing each step in the right order, and checking the measurement after every critical operation. He had looked at Craig's plan 7 years earlier, when it was still in its early stages, and he had designed around it. "He knew I'd come to the auction," Daniel said. "He believed you would. There's a difference." Dorothea looked at him. "He believed it the way he believed a joint would hold," she said. "Not because he wished it. Because he'd looked at the grain." Daniel drove to Jefferson City the following week and sat with a branch manager at the Credit Union of Central Missouri for 40 minutes and came out with a cashier's check for the full balance, including the CD, $50,140. He deposited it in his own account in Springfield, and then he sat in his car in the credit union parking lot for a while, not doing anything in particular, just sitting with the number. He had $72,940 total. The Springfield account, the inheritance, the truck money, the credit union balance. More than he had ever had at one time. Enough to do something with. He drove back to Calloway and went to see Virgil Pruitt. The credit union account was jointly owned, Virgil said. Predated the estate entirely. There's no mechanism for Craig to challenge it. What about the storage unit? The equipment? The lease was in Walter's name, but the auction was conducted correctly under Missouri statute. You purchased the contents at a legally valid auction. The estate had an opportunity to claim the unit during the asset inventory period and did not do so. Virgil took off his glasses. Craig's asset search was incomplete. That's his problem. He's going to figure out what's in the unit. Yes, and when he does, he'll want to know why it wasn't in the inventory. The answer is that it should have been. But the estate is settled, and the proceeds from the auction are a legitimate purchase by an unrelated bidder, which you are, legally. The prior relationship doesn't change the auction's validity. Virgil put his glasses back on. He may make noise. He won't prevail. Walter was careful. Daniel paid Virgil for the hour and drove to Millhaven and paid the back rent on the unit, 4 months at $68, which came to $272, and signed a new lease in his own name and paid 6 months in advance. Then he drove back to Springfield and did something he had been putting off for no clear reason. He sat down and made a list. What he had: $72,940. A 12 by 20 storage unit in Calloway, containing approximately $40,000 worth of precision machining equipment in excellent condition. 31 years of client records and project notebooks, and 16 client relationships of unknown current status. What he needed: training, incorporation, a business license, liability insurance, tooling, stock material, and whatever time it would take for his hands to learn what his father's hands had known. He made the list in the same kind of graph paper notebook Walter had used. He bought them in a pack of 10 at an office supply store. He wrote the first entry that night: Marsh Precision, start date, TBD. First objective: find out if any of the 16 clients are still in business. In May, Daniel drove to Jefferson City and met with an instructor at the State Technical College named Frank Odell, who taught precision machining to apprentices and had been doing so for 22 years. He brought 3 of Walter's project notebooks and set them on Frank's desk and let Frank read them. Frank read for 15 minutes without speaking. Half-thousandth tolerances, he said, on a self-taught setup. He started at the plant in '88, ran the Bridgeport there for 12 years. Plant work is not this. Plant work is production tolerances. You're making the same part 1,000 times to a spec sheet. This is custom work. Tool and die quality. He developed this on his own after the plant closed? From what I can tell. The notebooks go back to '89. Frank closed the notebook and set it on the stack. He looked at Daniel for a moment. You want to learn to run the business. I want to learn enough to do simple work myself and to evaluate what the machines can do. And to talk to clients without misrepresenting what we're capable of. We, Frank said. I'm incorporating as Marsh Precision. It was his business name. It's going to be mine. Frank was quiet. Then, come in on Saturdays. We'll start with the lathe. Bring the notebooks. 8 in the morning. Daniel drove back to Calloway every weekend through May and June. He opened the unit, turned on the lights, and spent 8 to 10 hours cleaning and inventorying the equipment. He found, in a box on the bottom shelf, Walter's complete set of tooling. End mills, drill bits, boring bars, reamers, all in labeled containers, all in usable condition. He found $500 worth of stock material, cold-rolled bar stock, aluminum flat bar, a coil of brass rod stored in a rack he'd built along the left wall. He found, in the 2015 project notebook, a running maintenance log for each machine, dates of lubrication, belt replacements, table calibrations. Walter had maintained the equipment as if the shop were still open. He had expected it to be opened again. He called Hal Debrecht in Versailles on a Saturday morning in early June. Hal's name appeared 9 times in the client records, most recently with a deferred balance of $1,100. Hal picked up on the 3rd ring. Hal, my name is Daniel Marsh, Walter Marsh's son. A pause. I heard about Walter, I'm sorry. Thank you. He had a note in his records about a balance outstanding for your account. A careful pause. He deferred that. His call, not mine. I offered to pay. I know. I'm calling because I'm reopening the shop. I wanted you to know the equipment's intact and I'm getting back up to speed. Silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Your dad told me this might happen, Hal said. He told me a couple of years ago that if a young man called with a Missouri number and Walter's account information, to take the call seriously. Said he hoped you'd call. A pause. You bring work to a machinist for 25 years, you get a sense for whether the next one will be worth the trouble. Walter said you'd be worth it. He coughed. I got a baler shaft that needs a collar replacing. Nothing complex. Come by when you're ready. Daniel set the phone down. He looked at the notebook open on the table in front of him. Hal Debrecht's name. 9 entries going back to 1996. The most recent in Walter's block printing a year before he got too sick to drive. Walter had told Hal to expect the call. Walter had told his clients, before he died, that someone was going to call. He had been building the handoff for 2 years, quietly, while he was still managing the illness, and Craig was planning what to do with the house. Craig had the house. He had $8,200 from it. If you've made it this far into Daniel Marsh's story, hit subscribe. Because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. By the end of June, 3 clients had been reactivated. Daniel had completed 4 jobs, 2 bushings, a replacement collar, a set of custom pins for an antique threshing machine restoration that a historical society in Columbia had contracted and had invoiced $820. The work took him twice as long as it would have taken Walter. He knew that. He kept his own project notebooks in the same format: graph paper, block printing, tolerances recorded. Time logged. He noted his errors and what had caused them. The first bushing job had gone wrong on the first attempt. He had set the parting tool at a half-degree off perpendicular, a mistake that showed up in the finished surface when he held the part under the drop light at the right angle, and he had scrapped the piece and started over. In the project notebook he wrote, Part 1 scrapped. Parting tool not trammed. Check tram before every parting operation. Time lost, 45 min. Material lost, 0.8 inches cold rolled. Cost, $4.20. He had found, in Walter's notebooks from the early 1990s, a nearly identical entry. Part 1 scrapped. Same reason. This will not happen twice. It had not happened again in 30 years of Walter's logs. Daniel read that entry 3 times and went back to the machine. The replacement collar for Hal Debrecht had been a different problem. The collar needed to fit a shaft that was nominally 1 inch in diameter, but had been worn down over 40 years to .987, a measurement that Walter's notebooks and the relevant client record had noted as measure first, machine second, never assume nominal. Daniel had measured. He had machined to the measurement. He had delivered the collar on a Tuesday afternoon, and Hal had fitted it in Daniel's presence, pressing it onto the shaft with a mallet, and it had seated without complaint. Hal had looked at it for a moment, and then he had said, "Your dad made me one of these about 15 years ago." Took him longer the first time, too. He had looked at Daniel. It fits the same. Frank Odell's Saturday sessions continued through July. Frank was methodical and precise in the way of someone who had spent decades trying to transmit precision to people who didn't yet have it, and he had a gift for identifying the exact thing a student was doing wrong, which he always described in terms of geometry and force rather than judgment. He told Daniel that most errors came from one of 3 sources: incorrect setup, incorrect measurement, or impatience. He said these were in descending order of how often they happened, and ascending order of how easy they were to fix. Impatience, he said, was the hardest one. Not because it was mysterious, but because the machinist knew they were being impatient and did it anyway. Because the part was almost done, and it was tempting to stop measuring and finish. Your father's notebooks, Frank said, one Saturday in late June, show a measurement logged after every critical operation. Not just at the end. After every one. That's the habit you need. Daniel wrote it in his own notebook. He was already doing it. He had not needed to be told, because Walter's notebooks had shown him. But he wrote it down anyway, because writing it made it a decision rather than an imitation. In late July, Frank gave Daniel the phone number of a master machinist in Columbia named Greta Schaefer, who took on consulting work. And Daniel spent 2 Tuesdays in August driving to Columbia and watching Greta set up and run a job from scratch, taking notes on a pad the whole time, asking questions that Greta answered with the directness of someone who had no patience for people who weren't. Serious, and could immediately tell that Daniel was. Your father was self-taught, Greta said on the second Tuesday. You have something he didn't have. What's that? You have his notebooks. She was quiet for a moment, setting up the next cut. You also have a different problem than he had. He had the skill and had to build the clients. You have the clients and have to build the skill. The question is whether the skill catches up before the clients get impatient. She looked at him. So far, the clients you've told me about are patient people. Farm equipment, historic restorations. These are people who know a thing takes as long as it takes. She started the cut. Stay in that lane until your numbers are where they need to be. Don't take aerospace or medical. Not yet. Daniel wrote that down too. In July, Daniel drove to Calloway for good. He gave notice to Bud Feely at the fact company. Bud said, as he had said he would, "Let me know when," and shook Daniel's hand, and that was the end of 4 years of work. And he rented a house on Elm Street for $650 a month and drove to Millhaven every morning at 7 and worked until 6 or 7 in the evening. He had incorporated Marsh Precision as a Missouri sole proprietorship. He had a business license from the county, general liability insurance through a carrier Frank Odell had recommended, and a Millhaven lease through the following spring. The house on Elm Street was a 2-bedroom rental that had last been updated in the early 1990s. The kitchen smelled of old paint, and the bathroom grout needed resealing, and the ceiling fan in the main bedroom made a quarter-turn wobble that Daniel fixed on the first evening by tightening the mounting screws. He did not do anything else to the house. He was not living in it so much as storing himself there between working hours. He ate at the BP station on Route 7 more often than he cooked, and he read Walter's notebooks in the evenings at the kitchen table the way other men his age watched television. July in central Missouri was 94 degrees most days, and the storage unit had no air conditioning, and Daniel worked through the heat with a box fan set in the open door, pulling air across the unit from front to back. He drank 2 liters of water before noon and 2 after, and he took no breaks except to check his measurements and log them. By the 3rd week of July, his shirt was wet through by 8:30 every morning and dry by the time he drove home. His hands were developing the calluses that precision machining required, not rough calluses, but a specific firmness at the fingertips and the base of the thumb. The kind that came from handling metal consistently and from the particular grip the micrometer required when you were measuring to a 0.5 and needed to feel the pressure as well as read the number. He called 2 more of Walter's clients in July. The first was a man named Dale Hess, who ran a grain elevator repair operation outside Tipton and who had 3 outstanding jobs from Walter's records, one of which was an urgent replacement for an auger shaft component that had failed 6 months earlier. Dale had been getting by with a welded patch, which he described on the phone with the resigned tone of someone who knows a bad repair is going to fail eventually. Daniel drove to Tipton on a Thursday and looked at the damaged component and measured it, and drove back to Calloway and spent the afternoon drawing up the replacement on graph paper. He called Dale on Friday and quoted $340, which was slightly below what Walter had charged for comparable work, and Dale said, "Your dad charged $380 and I never minded paying it. Do it right and bill me what it's worth." Daniel billed $380. The job took 2 days, and the result was within 0.0005 inches on the critical diameter, which he verified 3 times before calling Dale. Dale came and picked it up himself and fitted it in Daniel's presence and said nothing specific, but looked at the installation for a moment before wrapping it in a shop rag and loading it into his truck. "I'll bring you the other 2 jobs next week," he said. The second client he called in July was a woman named Rosa Caldera, who coordinated equipment restoration for a museum of agricultural history in Boonville, 40 minutes north. She had used Walter for 6 jobs over 8 years, the most recent a set of reproduction hardware for a 1910-era threshing machine. She answered Daniel's call on the first ring, as if she had been waiting for it. "We have 17 items in the restoration queue," she said. 7 of them are machined components. "We've been sitting on them since Walter got sick. I'd like to come and look at them. I was hoping you'd say that. Can you come Thursday?" He drove to Boonville on Thursday and spent 2 hours in the museum's restoration workshop with Rosa and a volunteer named Pete, who had been a millwright, and who looked at Daniel the way millwrights look at people who claim to know machines, carefully, with neutral eyes, waiting to see something specific. Daniel walked through each of the 7 components with Walter's relevant project notebooks open beside him, reading Walter's notes on the previous similar work, asking Rosa questions about dimensional accuracy requirements and which components were decorative versus functional. Pete watched. He did not say anything for most of the 2 hours. At the end, when Daniel was packing up the notebooks, Pete said, "You bring the lathe work on the threshing machine flywheel to within 1,000th? That's the spec, yes. Your dad did a flywheel for us in 2019. He brought it to .0008. I know. I read the notebook." Pete looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Rosa. "Let him start with the flywheel," he said. "We'll see." Daniel started with the flywheel. It took 4 days, and the final measurement was .0007 on the critical bore. He photographed the micrometer reading and included it with the invoice. Rosa called him 2 days after delivery to say Pete had looked at the measurement photograph for a long time before saying it was acceptable, which Rosa translated as Pete saying it was excellent, because Pete did not use the word excellent about machined work. The remaining 6 components were released to Daniel the following week. August came in hotter than July. The unit's corrugated steel walls absorbed and held the heat so that by 2 in the afternoon the interior was 101 degrees by the thermometer Daniel had mounted on the wall near the door. He worked through it. He had grown up in Missouri. He knew what August meant. He drank water and kept the fan running and logged his work and came home at 7 in the evening and read the notebooks and went to bed. By the end of August, he had completed 21 jobs, invoiced $7,840, and had active relationships with 9 of Walter's 16 original clients. He had also picked up 3 new clients, a small engine rebuilder in California, Missouri, who had found the Marsh Precision listing through the county business directory online, a farming operation outside Sedalia that had been referred by Hal Debrecht, and a tool and die shop in Jefferson City that had lost its main machinist and needed overflow work while it rehired. The Jefferson City shop's work was the most technically demanding he had accepted, and he had called Greta Schaefer before committing to it to walk through the tolerances. Greta had listened and said, "You can do it. Run the first piece oversized. Check it. Then bring it to final dimension. Don't try to do it in one pass." He ran the first piece oversized. He checked it. He brought it to final dimension in the second pass. The Jefferson City shop approved the work without comment, which the shop owner told him when Daniel asked was how they approved everything. "We only call when something's wrong," the owner said. "You haven't heard from us." Vernon Pate started coming by on Saturday mornings in August. Vernon was 68 years old and had been a millwright for 31 years before he retired, and he lived 4 miles from Millhaven on a property with a small workshop where he fixed things for neighbors and kept his tools in a condition that made the storage unit's equipment look like it was in good company. He had helped Walter move the Bridgeport into the unit 11 years earlier, using a borrowed engine hoist and 6 hours of careful work, and he had come by the unit periodically over the years when he was passing and the door was open. He showed up the first Saturday with 2 coffees from the BP station on Route 7 and stood in the unit door for a moment before coming in, looking at how Daniel had reorganized the layout. "You moved the grinder," he said. "Better light there. And the power outlet's closer." Vernon walked to the surface grinder and looked at the setup. Then he nodded. "Your father had it on the other wall because the wall mount for the dress was there. You'll want to add one." "I know. I've got the hardware." He came back the following Saturday and the one after that. He did not announce that he was going to come. He just came with 2 coffees and found something useful to do. Adjusting the tram on the Bridgeport, checking the lathe's tailstock alignment, sorting through the box of end mills, and identifying the ones that were still serviceable versus the ones that needed replacement. He worked alongside Daniel without much talk, the way men who know their work tend to work alongside each other. In late August, on a Saturday morning when Daniel was finishing an 8-piece run of replacement bushings for a combine header, Vernon sat on the stool near the door with his coffee and said, "Your father asked me once if I thought he was wrong to do it the way he did it. Keep the unit quiet. Let Craig have the house." Daniel did not stop the lathe. He let the pass finish before he spoke. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it looked right to me. I told him he knew his brother better than I did, and if he thought this was the way to protect what mattered, then that was his call." Vernon drank his coffee. "He said he hoped you'd come to the auction. I told him you would. He said he wasn't sure. He said you'd always been quick, and he wasn't sure quick was what the auction required. He thought I might not wait it out. He thought you might get angry and do something that gave Craig a legal argument." Vernon set his cup on the tool chest. "I told him you'd come, and you'd be patient." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I've watched him in the shop." "You watched me." "When you'd come up to visit, when you were younger. Walter'd have the door open. You'd come by and you'd walk in, and you'd go straight to the machines. Not to talk to your dad first, to the machines. And then to your dad." He looked at Daniel across the unit. "A man who goes to the machines first will come back to the machines. That's all." By September, 12 of Walter's 16 clients had been contacted. 9 had responded. 7 were active, placing work at a rate that had Daniel booked 4 weeks out. He had brought in $6,400 in invoiced work since June. He had turned down 2 jobs that were beyond his current skill level and had referred both to Greta Schaefer in Columbia, who had said, when he called to explain, "Good judgment. Come back to those in 6 months and they'll be easy." The September air in Calloway came in cooler than August had been, which meant the unit dropped to 78 degrees by mid-morning instead of holding in the 90s, and Daniel noticed the change the way you notice it when something that has been requiring effort stops requiring as much. He worked with the fan off most days now. The corrugated walls ticked in the mornings as the steel expanded with the rising sun, a sound he had begun to track without thinking about it. 2 ticks meant the sun was clearing the tree line east of the lot. 3 meant it had been up long enough to heat the roof. He had not intended to learn the sound. He had learned it the way you learn anything you're present for long enough. He reorganized the tool storage in September, building a second pegboard along the left wall for the measuring instruments, the micrometers, the calipers, the gauge blocks, the dial indicators. Because they had been sharing the main pegboard with the hand tools, and the arrangement was becoming crowded as he accumulated his own tooling alongside Walter's. He bought the plywood and the pine framing from a lumber yard in Jefferson City and built the pegboard on a Saturday morning in early September, drilling the mounting holes into the masonry block wall with a hammer drill borrowed from Vernon and anchoring it with sleeve anchors. It took him 4 hours. It was level within 1/8 of an inch, which was not as good as Walter's first pegboard, which was level within a 1/16, but which was good enough for the purpose and which he intended to improve. He painted the silhouette outlines himself, using a fine brush and the same black paint Walter had used, tracing each instrument in its resting position before hanging it on its hook. He worked slowly. He had the radio on, a country station out of Jefferson City that played music he did not particularly know, but that provided the right kind of low-level sound for this kind of work. When he was done, he stepped back and looked at the board. Each instrument in its place, each silhouette showing its outline. He could see, at a glance, if anything was out of its place. He looked at Walter's pegboard on the back wall, the one with 31 years of use, the silhouettes slightly faded, the hooks worn smooth at their bends. He looked at his own, new. The paint still sharp, He went back to the lathe and picked up where he'd left off. Vernon came by the following Saturday with 2 coffees and looked at the new pegboard without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your outlines are a little thick." "I know. I used a 1/2-inch brush. Dad used a 1/4 inch. Makes the outline wider than the instrument." Yes, Vernon looked at the board for another moment. Still better than most men would do. He handed Daniel his coffee. "I've got a level in the truck. I know you do. It's within an 1/8. Within a 1/16 is better. I know that too." Vernon smiled, which was something he did rarely and without drama. He took his coffee and sat on the stool near the door. Outside, the September morning light came across the lot at a low angle, catching the tops of the grass that had grown up along the fence line. Each blade lit from the side. Daniel drank his coffee and looked at the unit, his unit now, both of theirs in some sense that could not be precisely defined, and then put the cup down and went back to the lathe. The Saturday sessions with Frank Odell had ended in August, but Daniel went on driving to Columbia every other Tuesday to watch Greta run work, and the things he was learning were beginning to show up in his own numbers. The time logs in the project notebooks were getting shorter. The error rate, which he tracked without ceremony, was going down. He was not his father yet. He knew that. He was also not the man who had bid $53 on a storage unit 6 months ago. That man had known something was right, without knowing what it was. The man working in Unit 14 in October was starting to know both. Craig arrived on a Friday morning in mid-October. Daniel heard the Mercedes before he saw it. The lot at Millhaven was gravel, and the sound of tires on it was specific. And he did not turn from the Bridgeport. He was running a batch of 16 replacement pins for a grist mill outside Fulton, a job that had come in through the Missouri Historical Preservation Society, and that was going to take 3 days at $110 an hour. The Fulton Mill had been built in 1847, and its owner was meticulous about original dimension replacements, which was exactly the kind of work Walter had built his client list around. He finished the pass he was on, a 0.002-inch finish cut, and backed the table off and switched off the spindle. He turned around. Craig was standing in the open door of the unit. He was not looking at Daniel. He was looking at the machines. The Bridgeport, directly in front of him. The lathe along the right wall. The surface grinder in the back corner. The pegboard with its tools and their painted outlines. The shelves with 31 years of labeled boxes, each one in its place. The masking tape labels in Walter's block printing, going from floor to ceiling along the right wall. He stood with his jaw slightly forward, and his hands in his coat pockets, and his eyes moving slowly across what he was looking at. He had the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic that is not going the way he expected. Daniel waited. The silence lasted about 12 seconds. It was not an uncomfortable silence, which was notable. It was a silence that had information in it, and Craig was processing the information. "When did you find all this?" Craig asked. "When I paid $53 for it." Craig looked at him. He never mentioned it. No, he didn't. Craig walked into the unit. He stopped at the Bridgeport and looked at the table, the ways, the digital readout. He walked to the shelves and read the years on the boxes, slowly, going from the most recent down toward the floor. His eyes stopped on the box from the year Daniel was born. "How long was he running this?" Craig asked. 31 years. Craig processed that. He kept his eyes on the shelves. The equipment's worth something. Yes, it should have been in the estate inventory. It was in a storage unit that wasn't listed in the estate documents. Daniel set the pin he'd been holding on the tray. "The asset search was your responsibility." Craig looked at him. "I can take this to the court." have the settlement reopened. Virgil Pruitt says you can't. The auction was valid. The account was jointly owned before the estate was opened. Daniel picked up a rag and wiped the ways on the Bridgeport, not because they needed it, but because it was the next thing on the maintenance schedule and he had been about to do it anyway. If you want to spend money on an attorney, that's your decision. Craig was quiet. He looked at the shelves again. He looked at the pegboard, where every tool was in its place. He looked at the project notebooks on the tool chest near the door, the stack of them with the current one open on top, Daniel's own handwriting now in the same graph paper, the same format. He planned this, Craig said. Yes, for years. He stopped. While you were figuring out what to do with the house. Daniel looked at him. He knew what you were doing at the house. He'd known for a long time. He decided the house wasn't the thing that mattered. Craig stood with his coat on in the middle of the unit and looked at what Walter Marsh had spent 31 years building, and he did not say anything for a moment. His hands were still in his pockets. His jaw was still forward. He was looking at the box on the third shelf from the floor, the one labeled with the year Walter had gone to work at the plant, the year before Craig was born. I was trying to help him, Craig said. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing to say to it. It wasn't a claim that required a response. Craig knew what he had done. The sentence was what was left when everything else had been removed. Craig stood there for another moment. He looked at the Bridgeport one more time. Then he turned and walked out of the unit, across the gravel to the Mercedes. He opened the door and got in and drove away. Daniel watched the car leave the lot. Then he turned back to the machine and set the Bridgeport's table back to position and checked his measurement on the last pin he'd run. It was within tolerance. He set it in the tray with the others and started the spindle again. Dorothea knocked on the unit door around noon with a sandwich in a paper bag, which was something she had started doing on Fridays and which neither of them had acknowledged as a pattern. She set it on the tool chest and looked at the tray of finished pins. That for the Fulton job? First 16 of 48. 2 more days. She looked at the tray. Your father did work for that mill. 2017, I think. I remember him mentioning it. 2016 and 2018 both. I found the notebooks. Daniel switched off the spindle. Craig was here this morning. I saw the car. He said he was trying to help him. Dorothea was quiet. She looked at the pegboard along the back wall, the tools in their silhouettes, the wrenches in order, the micrometers in their cases. She had watched Walter arrange that pegboard 11 years ago on the day the equipment was moved in. She had stood in the door of the unit and watched him tap each hook into the board and hang each tool, and then step back to look at the arrangement and adjust 2 things. He wasn't wrong, you know, she said. Craig, not about wanting to help. He probably believed it. She turned back to Daniel. That's the thing about people like that. They're not wrong about wanting to be useful. They're wrong about what useful means. Daniel ate the sandwich. Outside, the October light was low and flat, coming across the lot at an angle that lit the gravel gold and made the shadows of the storage unit doors run long across the ground. Somewhere in the lot, a door was open and rattling in the wind. My dad told me something once, Daniel said. When I was 16, I'd screwed up a project and I was frustrated. He said, "You know it's wrong before you've measured it. That's worth more than you think." Dorothea waited. I didn't understand it at the time. I thought he meant I was good at seeing problems. He looked at the tray of pins on the table. He meant I was going to be the kind of person who would drive 4 hours in the dark and get there in time. He meant I was going to come to the auction. He looked up. He was telling me what he thought I was, before I knew. Dorothea nodded. She picked up the paper bag and folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. "He was right about you," she said. She went back to the office. Daniel turned to the Bridgeport and picked up the next piece of stock from the rack and loaded it into the chuck and set the stop and ran the facing pass. The light came through the open door and a long bar across the floor. The spindle's sound was steady and clean. He worked through the afternoon without stopping, running the stock down to length, facing, boring, chamfering, measuring after each critical step with the micrometer from its case on the pegboard, the numbers recording in his notebook in the same block printing Walter had used, the same tolerances, the same log. Vernon came by the following Saturday with 2 coffees. He sat on the stool near the door while Daniel finished the last run of pins for the Fulton job. When the final pin came off the lathe, Daniel fitted it to the gauge and checked it and set it in the tray with the others. 48 pins. 3 days. Complete, he walked to the shelves along the right wall. Walter's shelves, solid and level, every screw set correctly. Each shelf bearing its year without any sign of giving, and set the completed tray in the open space on the second shelf, between the micrometers and a box of raw stock. Vernon was looking at the shelves, at the labeled years going floor to ceiling, at the space on the second shelf where the tray now sat. "You're going to need more shelves," he said. "I know." Daniel closed his notebook. "I'm going to build them. I'll bring my level." Outside, a car was pulling into the Millhaven lot. The fabricator from Sedalia, who had a new job to discuss, a set of custom fixtures for a production line, the kind of work that Walter's notebooks showed he had done twice before, the kind that would run 2 weeks and bill at the higher rate. Daniel had spoken to him twice on the phone and had reviewed the specs, and had called Greta Schaefer to walk through the tolerances before committing. He pulled the unit door halfway down to keep the wind off the machines and walked out into the flat October light to meet the car. Behind him, Unit 14 held what Walter Marsh had spent 31 years building in silence: the Bridgeport, the lathe, the grinder, the pegboard with every tool in its place, the 31 years of notebooks on their solid shelves, each year in its box, each box where it belonged. The sign on the door read Marsh Precision, Custom Machining, and the tray of finished pins sat on the second shelf, and the unit was open and running. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment. What would you have done in Daniel's position?